So the final social and political revolution we need to talk about here is the rise of nationalism in Western Europe and actually throughout Eastern Europe and eventually diffuses throughout the world. Um, so nationalism is a byproduct of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and Napoleon's conquests of Europe are a key factor in promoting and spreading this idea of nationalism. And so, nationalism is by definition, the strong belief and promotion of one's nation or cultural group above all others, and oftentimes in opposition to all others. Now, what this means, and probably the easiest way to understand this, is that everyone falls into multiple social groups and categories, right? Me personally, I fall into racially, I am white. Um, Socially, I am middle class. Culturally, I am American German. Um, in terms of biologically, I am male. These types of things, and everyone falls into multiple groups. So, nationalism is the idea that of all of these groups that you fall into, that your loyalty and your identity is tied to the cultural group that you fall into, right? So, for example, if you're walking down the street and someone stops you and says, "Hey, what are you?" Rather than identifying with your sex, "Oh, I'm male, female," rather than identifying with your political affiliation, "Oh, I'm Republican, Democrat," rather than identifying with your race, "Oh, I'm black, white, Asian, whatever," that you would associate with your cultural group above all of those, right? I'm Italian, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Dominican, etc., right? So nationalism becomes a pretty opposing political force in the 19th century. And it is a byproduct of several things. Number one, it's a byproduct of these revolutionary feelings brought on by the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the ideas of popular sovereignty, right? That the people should determine their form of government, the idea of self determination, the idea that certain groups who are bound by these cultural bonds should also have the right to choose or determine their own political structure, that they shouldn't be forced to um, live under a government which does not represent them culturally, like a kingdom or a large empire, right? Another factor in nationalism's rise in importance is the globalization of trade and of business, especially during the process of industrialization. Because of this globalized trade, because products from one region of the world are now making their way to other regions of the world, businessmen from one continent are having close ties with businessmen from other continents. This begins to break down the traditional regional and local loyalties that people have. So rather than saying, "Oh, I'm from the South," or "I'm from Venice," or I'm a Londoner, people begin to feel that their loyalty, rather than being local, is national, that they share some cultural bond that makes them part of a larger nation. So rather than "I'm from Rome and you're from Venice," we're all Italian, right? Rather than "I'm from the South and you're from the Midwest," we're all American per se, right? And then finally, another big part of this process is the Enlightenment and the Atlantic Revolutions challenge the traditional form of government that we've dealt with for most of human history, which is the idea of empire. Um, in empire, you have usually one social or cultural group that rules a large political unit that encompasses multiple cultures, multiple nationalities, multiple races, multiple ethnicities. And generally, these smaller minority groups are ruled by this foreign power by force. And nationalism promotes the idea that each unique nation should have the right of self governance, that they should be able to pick based on their cultural bonds what type of government best suits them and their people, right? Now, there is an important distinction that I want to make here. Oftentimes, when discussing politics, and I've probably been guilty of this across the course of this class as well, people oftentimes use the word nation and state interchangeably. And unfortunately, they're not. A nation is a community of people who share a common language, culture, ethnicity, descent, and background, right? um, Puerto Ricans, Italians, Irish, right? These are people who have a common language, common culture, ethnicity, and background. Whereas a state is a political unit, okay? It's a body of people that occupy a defined territory. They are organized by political boundaries and they share a common government. So, an example of a state would be, France. It would be Florida. It would be Cuba, right? These are states. But states can also be nations, right? If you have a political entity that has a definite territory, it has political boundaries, it has a common government, and the people of that state also share a common cultural bond, then you have what we call a nation state. And that is going to become the premier and primary form of government going forward from this point in history onwards. Okay. So one is not necessarily the other. One can be the other, but they don't necessarily have to be, right? So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about here, right? So this is an example of nationalism, right? These people are members of a distinct political unit, namely the United States of America. But in the case of this photo, they are not identifying with that state. They are not identifying with their gender. They are not identifying with their social status. What they are identifying here with is their cultural group above all things, right? They are celebrating their background and their heritage as Puerto Ricans, right? Similar to this picture, right? The people in this picture are also uniting behind a cultural group, in this case being Irish. Now, is everybody in this photo Irish? No, probably not. But St. Patrick's Day is a cultural celebration. It is a celebration of nationalism. It is a celebration of what makes the Irish people distinct and unique culturally, right? Now, on the other hand, you have this example, right? Now, this is an example of not nationalism. This is an example of what we call patriotism. And the reason why is if you look at the children in this picture, it becomes pretty obvious that these children more than likely do not share the same ethnic, cultural, and language and background as each other. Okay, you have children of different ethnicities, of different backgrounds, probably of different social and economic statuses as well, right? But yet in this, they are identifying themselves with their political unit, right? They're identifying themselves with the United States of America over all of the other groups in which they fall. So this would be defined as patriotism rather than nationalism. Now, nationalism plays a very positive role in politics, especially in Europe going forward. Um, Nationalism is used by people in power to create unity among divided peoples. In both Germany and Italy in the 1800s, nationalism is used to unify the separate city states and principalities in both Germany and Italy to create a unified Germany and a unified Italian state. It also inspires movements for independence by conquered minorities. You have groups like the Greeks, the Bulgarians, and the Romanians who all declare independence from the Ottoman Empire. You have the Polish and the Lithuanians who declare independence from Russia. You have the Irish and the Indian people who use nationalism to gain independence from the British Empire, right? Nationalism also is a key tool in generating unity in diverse states. It helps to provide a single unifying culture that is promoted usually pretty strongly by the government. For example, the United States of America is an excellent example of nationalism versus patriotism. Because of the racial and the ethnic makeup of the United States, because you have mixtures of Native Americans, transplanted Europeans, transplanted West African slaves, as well as all of the different mixed cultures, right? Mestizos, mulattoes, etc. Um, Cultural unity in a state like the United States of America is incredibly difficult. So, what you see in the 18th and 19th and even in the 20th century is the government of the United States and politicians within the United States trying to generate symbols of a distinct American culture to help unify people behind their political goals, right? The idea of patriotic or nationalistic songs, things like the Pledge of Allegiance, um, images like Uncle Sam, other cultural unifiers like the idea of baseball or basketball as America's game, right? These are all things that have been generated as cultural unifiers. And these are things that nationalism, helps bring people together in order to bring diverse cultures under one tent or under one flag. Now, nationalism also can be used negatively. Um, a lot of times, nationalism is used to generate an us versus them mentality, right? Or an us versus the world mentality. Oftentimes, nationalism is used to divide states as well. You see nationalism used quite a bit when there are struggles between governments and ethnic minorities. Um, Nationalism also can be used for persecution of certain minorities. Um, because here's the flip side of nationalism is not only used to define your nation and who you are, but it's also used to define who you are not or who isn't you. One of the easiest ways to see this is, go up to any, specific nationality and accuse them of being a different nationality. And they will lecture you at length as to why they are not that nationality. If go to a Puerto Rican person and accuse them of being Dominican or Cuban, they will gladly tell you all of the reasons they are not Puerto Rican or not Cuban and Dominican, and that they are Puerto Rican and what it means to be Puerto Rican, right? Go to any Vietnamese person and ask them about being Chinese, and they will lecture you at length about how being Vietnamese is not the same as being Chinese. And this goes for any nationality, right? Accuse an Italian person of being Spanish, accuse a Portuguese person of being Spanish. And again, they will lecture you at length as to why their nation and why their cultural group is different, unique, and distinct, and in a lot of cases better than other cultural groups, right? So the final part of this lecture is a video that I selected for you that I want you to watch to help kind of illustrate how nationalism can be used. So this is a recording of Adolf Hitler in the early days of his rise to power, before he is the Führer and the leader of the German state. And Hitler was a master at using nationalism not only to define what it meant to be German, but also who wasn't German. And Hitler would use nationalism to set apart the German people from other minorities within Germany to create a culturally unified state so that he could use that cultural unity for his own political ends. Now, we know the history of German cultural unity under Adolf Hitler, and it is not pretty. It's you know, most one of the most awful things in human history. But what this video shows, and what I want you guys to look for as you watch it, are look for the ways that Hitler uses nationalism to gain political unity, to gain political strength, and to bring people under the banner of his National Socialist Party.